Most people can recognize the island of Ireland, that green jewel resting on the northwestern edge of Europe, yet far fewer truly understand the long and turbulent story that shaped it. Today, the island stands divided between two political entities: the Republic of Ireland, a fully independent nation covering most of the land, and Northern Ireland, which remains part of the United Kingdom. This division, though seemingly modern, is the result of centuries, indeed millennia, of conflict, migration, faith, and resilience. Ireland's story is one of survival and identity. It is the story of a people who have endured invasion, famine, and oppression, yet who have never lost their language, their culture, or their deep sense of belonging to the land. To understand Ireland is to follow its journey from ancient tribes and stone monuments to empires, revolutions, and rebirth. This is the entire history of Ireland. Long before recorded history, humans were already here. Archaeological discoveries show that the first settlers arrived around 10,000 years ago as the Ice Age retreated and forests began to spread across the island. These early hunter-gatherers crossed from Britain by land bridges or short sea routes, following herds and rivers into this new and fertile place. They left behind stone tools, animal bones, and traces of their fires, the faint beginnings of human life in Ireland. By around 4,000 years before Christ, a great change began. Farming arrived. People learned to cultivate grain, raise livestock, and build permanent settlements. Villages appeared in valleys and along rivers, and communities began to shape the landscape. These early farmers also built monumental tombs from giant stones, structures that still stand today as silent witnesses to their world. The most famous, Newgrange, was constructed around 3200 BC, older than the pyramids of Egypt. Aligned precisely with the rising sun of the winter solstice, its inner chamber fills with light only once each year. It reveals a civilization deeply in tune with the cycles of nature, birth, and death. Over the next 2,000 years, new materials brought new ways of life. The Bronze Age introduced metal tools and weapons, and later, the Iron Age transformed warfare and trade. Yet Ireland remained a land of scattered tribes, bound more by kinship than by kingship. Isolated from the sweeping empires of the Mediterranean, the island grew apart, developing its own rhythms, stories, and gods. Then, around the middle of the first millennium BC, came a cultural wave that would shape Ireland's identity for centuries to come: the arrival of the Celts. Whether through migration or gradual influence, Celtic language and culture took root, blending with the traditions already here. With them came new art, new beliefs, and a society based on clans and chieftains. Each tribe held its own territory, ruled by a local lord, but all shared a similar structure of law, custom, and ritual. This was the beginning of Gaelic Ireland. It was not a single nation, but rather a mosaic of small kingdoms, united by language, divided by ambition. Above them all, in legend and sometimes in reality, stood the High King, said to rule from the hill of Tara. Life revolved around honor, poetry, and oral tradition. Bards and storytellers carried history in verse, while druids guided the people in religion, philosophy, and law. The Celtic gods ruled over forests, rivers, and battlefields, and their symbols, spirals, knots, and crosses, were carved into stone and jewelry. For centuries, Ireland thrived in its own unique rhythm. Unlike Britain, it never fell under Roman control. This isolation protected its traditions, allowing Gaelic society to evolve independently. To the Romans, Ireland, whom they called Hibernia, was mysterious, distant, and unconquered. To its own people, it was sacred ground, bound to ancestors and spirits who lived in the hills and rivers. But even isolation cannot last forever. Beyond the seas, empires rose and fell, and new ideas began to flow across the world. Among them came a belief that would transform Ireland more deeply than any invasion could: the arrival of Christianity. When Christianity first began to spread across Europe in the later centuries of the Roman Empire, Ireland remained a world apart, untouched by Roman roads, legions, or cities. But as the empire declined in the 4th and 5th centuries, its influence still managed to reach across the Irish Sea. Traders, missionaries, and captured slaves carried whispers of this new faith to Ireland's shores. Among those slaves was a young man from Roman Britain named Patrick. According to tradition, he was captured by Irish raiders and brought to Ireland as a shepherd. Years later, after escaping and returning home, he felt a divine calling to go back, to bring the message of Christianity to the very land of his captivity. His mission would change Ireland forever. By the early 5th century, Patrick and other missionaries began converting the Irish from Celtic paganism to Christianity. At first, progress was slow. The Druids and clan chiefs resisted the foreign faith. But over time, Christianity spread from court to court and valley to valley. By the 6th century, the old gods had largely faded, and Ireland had become one of the most devoutly Christian lands in Europe. Yet this transformation did not erase Ireland's older traditions. It reshaped them. The Irish Church blended Celtic symbolism with Christian theology, creating a culture unlike any other. Crosses were carved with spirals and interlaced patterns. Ancient festivals were reimagined as Christian holy days. The monks who followed St. Patrick built monasteries across the island, places like Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Kells, which became centers of faith, learning, and art. These monasteries became Ireland's first true cities of the mind. The monks copied sacred texts and preserved the knowledge that elsewhere in Europe was being lost to war and chaos. They recorded the ancient oral traditions of Gaelic culture, blending myth and history into written form. The result was a remarkable preservation of Celtic heritage within a Christian framework. By the 7th century, Ireland had become known as the Island of Saints and Scholars. Its monks traveled far beyond their homeland, reintroducing learning and Christianity to parts of Europe that had fallen into the Dark Ages. They founded monasteries in Scotland, England, France, and even Italy. Ireland, untouched by Roman conquest, became a beacon of civilization in a world of turmoil. Art and scholarship flourished. Monks illuminated manuscripts with intricate designs that still astonish historians today. The most famous of these is the Book of Kells, a masterpiece of calligraphy and ornamentation that fused Celtic art with Christian devotion. Goldwork, stone crosses, and carved reliquaries reflected the island's deep spiritual and artistic energy. But while the church grew powerful, Ireland remained politically fragmented. The old clan system endured, with dozens of rival kingdoms ruled by Gaelic chieftains. The High King, often seated at Tara, held symbolic authority, but his power depended on fragile alliances and constant warfare. Ireland's political unity existed more in legend than in reality. Still, the Christian transformation brought a sense of shared identity. For the first time, the people of Ireland were connected not only by language and culture, but by a common faith. Monasteries provided more than spiritual guidance. They became centers of justice, medicine, and refuge. They were repositories of both religion and national memory. For several centuries, this golden age of learning and spirituality endured. Ireland thrived in relative peace, distant from the conflicts of continental Europe. Its fields were fertile, its ports active, and its monasteries filled with scholars. But prosperity attracts attention. Far to the north, across the cold seas, a new threat was beginning to stir. They came not for faith or knowledge, but for plunder and power. The Irish monks who had once sent missionaries abroad would soon find their own sanctuaries under attack. In the closing years of the 8th century, the sails of longships appeared on the horizon. The Vikings had arrived. The peace that had long blessed Ireland shattered in the late 8th century. From the cold seas of Scandinavia came long, narrow ships with curved prows, swift, silent, and deadly. The first recorded Viking raid struck in 793 AD at the monastery of Lindisfarne in England. Only a few years later, Ireland would feel the same terror. The first attacks came suddenly and without warning. Small bands of Norse raiders landed on the coasts, burning monasteries, seizing treasure, and taking slaves. Holy places that had stood for generations, Iona, Clonmacnoise, Kells, and many others, became targets. To the Vikings, these monasteries were rich, undefended, and filled with gold and silver. To the Irish, they were sacred homes of learning and faith. The shock was immense. At first, the Vikings came and went like storms, striking fast and vanishing back to sea. But as the years passed, their raids grew bolder and more organized. By the middle of the 9th century, they began to stay through the winters, building fortified camps along the coast. These bases, called long forts, became the seeds of Ireland's first true towns. Among them were names that would echo through history: Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, all founded by Norse settlers. What began as raiding camps evolved into thriving trade centers, linking Ireland to the Viking world of Scandinavia, Britain, and beyond. The relationship between the Irish and the Norse was complex. There was war, yes, but also trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. Some Viking leaders took Irish wives and adopted Gaelic customs. Likewise, many Irish kings made alliances with Viking forces to strengthen their own power against rival clans. Over time, the lines between invader and native blurred. By the 10th century, Dublin had become one of the wealthiest ports in Western Europe, its markets bustling with goods from as far away as Arabia and Byzantium. Silver coins, glassware, silk, and weapons flowed through its docks. The Norse also brought new technologies, shipbuilding, navigation, and urban planning that changed Irish society forever. Yet Ireland was not conquered. The Gaelic kingdoms adapted and resisted, led by fierce and ambitious kings. One of the greatest among them was Brian Boru, born around 941 AD. Rising from a small kingdom in Munster, he united many of Ireland's divided clans under his rule. Through a combination of diplomacy, warfare, and vision, he became High King of Ireland, one of few in history to truly command authority over most of the island. Brian Boru's reign marked a rare moment of unity. He sought to end centuries of tribal rivalry and Viking dominance. His greatest test came in 1014 AD, at the Battle of Clontarf, near Dublin. There, Brian's army faced a coalition of Viking warriors and rebel Irish kings. The battle was fierce and bloody, fought from sunrise until the tide turned. In the end, Brian's forces prevailed, but at a terrible cost. The High King himself was killed, and his death plunged Ireland back into division. After Clontarf, Viking power in Ireland began to fade. Many Norse settlers had already become part of the Irish world, speaking Gaelic, adopting local customs, and intermarrying with Irish families. Their towns remained, their trade endured, and their legacy became inseparable from the fabric of Irish life. The age of raids was over, but a new era was beginning. The Irish kingdom stood divided once more, and in that division lay their weakness. Across the sea, a new power was rising, one that would not come merely to raid, but to rule. Soon, the Normans would arrive. By the 12th century, Ireland was still a land of many kings but no single nation. Dozens of Gaelic rulers controlled their own territories, constantly shifting alliances through warfare and marriage. The idea of one unified Ireland remained more dream than reality. Yet while local kings fought each other, across the Irish Sea, a new and powerful kingdom was expanding its reach: Norman England. The Normans were descendants of Viking settlers who had made their home in Normandy, France. Fierce warriors and skilled administrators, they had conquered England in 1066 under William the Conqueror. Over the next century, Norman lords built castles, churches, and cities, spreading their rule across Britain. Eventually, their ambitions turned toward Ireland. The story of how they came begins not with conquest, but with betrayal. In the year 1166, the King of Leinster, Diarmaid mac Murchua, was overthrown by rival Irish kings and forced into exile. Desperate to reclaim his throne, Diarmaid turned to England for help. He sought aid from King Henry II, promising loyalty in exchange for military support. Henry agreed, and in 1169, the first group of Norman knights, led by Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, landed on Ireland's southeastern coast. What began as a small expedition quickly grew into a full-scale invasion. The Normans were better armed, disciplined, and organized than the Irish warriors, whose strength lay in guerrilla warfare and local alliances. Within months, Strongbow had captured Wexford, Waterford, and finally Dublin, establishing a powerful foothold. When Diarmaid died soon after, Strongbow claimed the kingship of Leinster for himself. King Henry II, wary of his knights' growing power, crossed the sea in 1171 with a massive army, the first English king ever to set foot in Ireland. The Irish chiefs, divided and cautious, submitted to him one by one. With little resistance, Henry declared himself Lord of Ireland, bringing the island under English influence. Though the conquest was incomplete, it marked the beginning of more than 800 years of English involvement in Irish affairs. Over the next century, the Normans spread across much of the island, building stone castles and fortified towns. They introduced new laws, farming methods, and feudal systems. Towns like Kilkenny, Trim, and Limerick grew under their rule, while grand cathedrals and monasteries reflected both faith and power. Yet outside these centers, much of Gaelic Ireland endured, its language, laws, and customs thriving beyond the Norman Pale, the fortified regions surrounding Dublin. Over time, the boundaries blurred once again. Many Norman lords married into Gaelic families, adopted the Irish language, and lived according to Irish customs. So much so that an old saying emerged: the English became more Irish than the Irish themselves. However, the English crown grew uneasy with this blending. By the 14th century, it issued the Statutes of Kilkenny, 1366, laws designed to prevent intermarriage, Irish dress, and even the speaking of Gaelic among settlers. These attempts to separate the two cultures largely failed, but they revealed a deep tension that would persist for centuries: the struggle between English authority and Irish identity. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, Ireland was a patchwork land. Norman lords ruled the east and south, while Gaelic chieftains controlled the west and north. The English king's influence was weak beyond the Pale, and the dream of a united Ireland seemed distant. Yet beyond the horizon, new powers were rising. The Tudor dynasty in England sought to tighten control over the entire island, and with it came the shadow of religious conflict that would transform Ireland once again. The age of medieval Ireland was ending. The age of conquest and colonization was about to begin. The dawn of the 16th century brought a storm that would reshape Ireland forever. Across Europe, kingdoms were centralizing their power, and monarchs were no longer content to rule through distant lords or fragile alliances. In England, the Tudor dynasty, fierce, ambitious, and determined, set its sights on completing what the Normans had begun centuries earlier: the full conquest of Ireland. At that time, Ireland remained divided between two worlds. In the east, the English Pale, centered around Dublin, lived under English law and custom. Beyond it stretched a vast landscape ruled by independent Gaelic chieftains and powerful Norman-Irish families who had long since adopted Irish ways. For generations,
English control had been weak, but under the Tudors, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, that would change. In 1541, Henry VIII declared himself King of Ireland, ending the title Lord of Ireland that had existed since the days of Henry II. His goal was not merely conquest, but complete control, political, military, and spiritual. At the same time, Europe was being torn apart by the Protestant Reformation. When Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England, Ireland, deeply Catholic and loyal to Rome, became a religious battleground. The English crown now viewed Ireland not only as a rebellious frontier, but as a potential base for Catholic enemies, especially Spain and France. To secure it, Henry and his daughter Elizabeth launched a series of brutal campaigns against Irish lords who resisted their rule. The government introduced the policy of surrender and re-grant, demanding that Irish chiefs surrender their lands to the king and then receive them back as English-style nobles, sworn to obey the crown and adopt English customs. Some accepted, many did not. The resistance was fierce. Gaelic chieftains like Shane O'Neill in Ulster and Gerald Fitzgerald, the Earl of Desmond in Munster, rose against English encroachment. Their rebellions were crushed with devastating force. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and thousands of people were killed. The wars of the late 1500s were among the bloodiest Ireland had ever seen. The greatest of these uprisings was the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, led by Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. A brilliant strategist, O'Neill united many Irish clans and even secured aid from Catholic Spain. For a time, it seemed he might succeed in driving out English rule entirely. But after the defeat of the Irish and Spanish forces at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, the dream of a free Gaelic Ireland collapsed. O'Neill and other leaders fled the island in what became known as the Flight of the Earls, 1607, marking the end of the old Gaelic order. With their departure, the English crown seized vast tracts of Irish land, especially in Ulster, and began settling English and Scottish Protestants there in what was called the Plantation of Ulster. This colonization permanently changed Ireland's demographic and religious landscape. Protestant settlers dominated the north, while the rest of the island remained overwhelmingly Catholic.
The seeds of centuries-long conflict were sown. What began as a conquest of land became a struggle over faith, identity, and survival. Ireland was now a land divided not only by politics, but by religion, Catholic and Protestant, native and settler. Under the Tudors, the Irish language was suppressed, monasteries were destroyed, and traditional laws were outlawed. Yet even in defeat, Irish culture endured in secret, kept alive in songs, stories, and faith. By the early 17th century, Ireland had been conquered but not truly tamed. A fragile peace held under English rule, but resentment burned beneath the surface. Soon, that resentment would erupt again, this time in open rebellion, setting the stage for one of the darkest chapters in Irish history. The age of rebellion and colonization had begun. The 17th century opened with Ireland under firm English control, or so it seemed. The Tudor conquest had left the island politically subdued, but culturally and spiritually unbroken. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The old Gaelic families had lost their lands, Catholic worship was outlawed, and English settlers, mostly Protestant, were pouring into the country, especially in Ulster, where the plantations had transformed ancient territories into foreign colonies. The divide between the native Irish and the Protestant settlers deepened each year. The new landowners built fortified towns, while dispossessed Irish peasants worked the soil that had once been their own. Tension turned to hatred, and hatred to rebellion. In 1641, it finally exploded.
Irish Catholics, desperate to reclaim their lands and freedom, launched a massive uprising across the island. The rebellion began in Ulster, where Irish forces attacked English and Scottish settlers, seizing castles and driving out colonists. What followed was chaos. Atrocities committed on both sides, villages burned, and thousands killed. The rebellion quickly spread, and soon all of Ireland was at war. At first, the rebels fought for religious freedom and the restoration of their rights under the crown. But as the conflict deepened, it became part of a much larger war engulfing England itself. The English Civil War between Charles I and Parliament. Ireland became a battlefield not just for Irish freedom, but for the fate of the British Isles. When Oliver Cromwell emerged victorious in England, he turned his attention to Ireland with ruthless determination. In 1649, he landed at Drogheda with a powerful army, vowing to crush resistance once and for all. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in Irish history. At Drogheda, Cromwell's forces slaughtered thousands, soldiers and civilians alike. Days later, at Wexford, the same horror was repeated. His campaign of conquest was brutal and unrelenting. Entire towns were destroyed, lands confiscated, and Catholic priests executed. To many in Ireland, Cromwell became a symbol of terror, a name still remembered with bitterness centuries later. By 1653, Ireland lay devastated. Nearly half the population had died from war, famine, or disease. Vast tracts of land were confiscated and given to English soldiers and Protestant settlers. The surviving Irish Catholics were driven westward into the poor lands of Connacht. The phrase, "to hell or to Connacht," became a grim symbol of their fate. Under Cromwell and later the English Commonwealth, Ireland was effectively turned into a colony. Its people oppressed, its culture suppressed, and its faith driven underground. The Catholic Church was outlawed. Irish priests hid in the countryside, celebrating Mass in secret. The Gaelic nobility was broken, and English law and Protestant power dominated the island. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the new king, Charles II, offered a brief hope of reconciliation. Some confiscated lands were returned and restrictions eased, but the deep wounds remained. The country was divided between Protestant landowners who held wealth and power and a Catholic majority who lived in poverty and exclusion.
These divisions only sharpened under James II, the last Catholic king of England. When he was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Ireland became the final battleground between Catholic and Protestant rule. The Irish rallied behind James, while the English Parliament supported William of Orange, his Protestant son-in-law. The conflict came to a head at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, near Drogheda, the same land once drenched in Cromwell's bloodshed. James's forces were defeated, sealing Protestant dominance in Ireland for generations. The war ended with the Treaty of Limerick in 1691, promising tolerance for Catholics, but those promises were soon broken. What followed was a century of oppression known as the Penal laws. Catholics were barred from owning land, holding public office, or practicing their faith openly. Education in Irish or Catholic schools was forbidden. The Irish language retreated to the hills and cottages, surviving only in whispers and songs. Ireland had become a conquered nation within its own homeland, ruled by a small Protestant elite, watched over by English law, and kept silent by poverty and fear. But even in this darkness, the spirit of Ireland endured. The faith, the stories, and the longing for freedom lived on in its people, passed down through generations like an unextinguished flame. That flame would burn again, and in the next century, it would begin to rise. The dawn of the 18th century found Ireland silent but seething. The land was conquered, its people subdued, and its faith suppressed under a rigid system designed to keep the Irish powerless. This was the age of the Penal laws, a network of restrictions that sought to dismantle Irish identity itself. For the vast majority, who were Catholic, life was a daily struggle under laws crafted to break both spirit and society. They could not vote, hold public office, own a weapon, or serve in the army. They could not receive an education, practice law, or openly teach their faith. Land ownership, the very foundation of Irish life, was stripped away. Catholics could not inherit or purchase property freely. In some places, even a horse worth more than £5 was forbidden. Only a small Protestant minority, known as the Protestant Ascendancy, held power. They controlled Parliament, commerce, and the courts. Their estates dominated the countryside, while the Catholic poor labored as tenants on land that had once been their ancestors. The church bells of Ireland rang only for the rulers. The faith of the majority was driven underground. But even in the shadow of oppression, Ireland endured. The people clung to their traditions, speaking Irish in their homes, preserving songs and stories that kept memory alive. Hidden priests said Mass on stone altars in the fields, watched by farmers at dawn. The very act of prayer became an act of resistance. Despite its suffering, Ireland was not isolated from the wider world. The 18th century was a time of revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, when new ideas about liberty and human rights began to challenge the old order. Across the Atlantic, the American Revolution, 1776, declared that all men were created equal. Shortly after, the French Revolution, 1789, proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity. These ideas found fertile ground even in Ireland's soil. Among the Protestant elite themselves, some began to question the justice of their dominance. The Irish Volunteers, originally formed to defend Ireland from invasion during the American War of Independence, began calling for greater self-government. In 1782, their pressure led to a brief political victory. The Irish Parliament gained legislative independence from London, but this Parliament still represented only Protestants. Catholics and most Presbyterians had no voice. Then came a new generation inspired not by loyalty to England, but by the universal cry for freedom. The most famous among them was Theobald Wolfe Tone, a Protestant lawyer from Dublin who dreamed of uniting all Irish people, Catholic, Protestant, and Dissenter, under one banner. In 1791, he helped found the Society of United Irishmen, dedicated to liberty, equality, and the end of English rule. Their movement grew quickly, drawing support from farmers, merchants, and intellectuals. They believed that religious division was the greatest weapon used to keep Ireland enslaved, and they vowed to end it. The dream was simple yet radical, an independent Irish republic. But dreams met brutal reality. In 1798, inspired by revolutionary France, the United Irishmen launched a nationwide rebellion. It began in Leinster and spread across the country, with fierce battles in Wexford, Antrim, and Down. For a moment, it seemed the tide of history might turn. Peasants armed with pikes rose against the British army. Entire villages joined the cause. Yet the rebellion was crushed with terrible ferocity. Tens of thousands were killed, many in open combat, others in mass executions and reprisals. Wolfe Tone himself was captured and took his own life in prison, declaring that Ireland shall be free. The uprising failed, but its spirit never died. It exposed the depth of Irish suffering
and the growing power of the idea that Ireland's destiny was her own. The British government, fearing another revolution, sought to tighten control once more. And so, at the turn of the 19th century, came one of the most consequential acts in Irish history, the Act of Union, 1801, which merged Ireland formally with Great Britain, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Irish Parliament was dissolved. From now on, Ireland would be ruled directly from London. The dream of freedom was silenced once again, at least for a time. But beneath the Union Jack, the Irish spirit still smoldered. Hunger, faith, and defiance would soon drive it to rise again. The beginning of the 19th century marked a new chapter in Ireland's long, uneasy history. After centuries of conquest, rebellion, and suppression, the island was now legally bound to its conqueror through the Act of Union of 1801. The once independent Irish Parliament in Dublin was dissolved, and Ireland was governed directly from Westminster as part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The promise of the Union, at least in theory, was progress, economic growth, equal opportunity, and shared prosperity. But for the Irish majority, it brought little of that. The same landlords ruled the countryside. The same poverty lingered in the villages, and the same divisions of class and faith defined everyday life. Still, a new generation of Irish leaders began to rise, educated, articulate, and determined to seek justice through law rather than rebellion. Chief among them was Daniel O'Connell, a lawyer known as the Liberator. Born into a Catholic family when Catholics still had almost no rights, O'Connell devoted his life to changing that. Through brilliant organization and nonviolent mass movements, he campaigned for Catholic emancipation, the right for Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold public office. His movement was immense. From city streets to rural parishes, Irish people gathered in peaceful monster meetings by the thousands, cheering for O'Connell and the dream of equality. His persistence paid off. In 1829, after years of pressure, the British government finally passed the Catholic Relief Act, lifting many of the penal laws. For the first time in over a century, Irish Catholics could serve in government and have a voice in their own affairs. It was a historic victory, but it was not the end of Ireland's suffering. Beneath the political reforms, the social structure remained fragile. The vast majority of Irish people were tenant farmers living in desperate poverty. The land was divided into small plots and rents were paid to absentee landlords who often lived in London and cared little for the people who worked their estates. Families relied almost entirely on one crop, the potato, which grew well in poor soil and yielded enough to sustain large families.
But in 1845, disaster struck. A strange disease, Phytophthora infestans, a fungal blight, appeared in the fields, blackening and rotting the potato crop. Within months, famine spread like wildfire. The blight returned year after year, wiping out the staple food of millions. The British government's response was tragically slow, often indifferent, and sometimes cruel. Ships continued to leave Irish ports carrying food exports while the people starved. The workhouses overflowed. Families sold everything they owned to survive. In just a few short years, over 1 million people died of hunger and disease. Another 1 million fled, crossing the Atlantic in packed ships, many of which became floating coffins. Entire villages vanished. The Great Famine, 1845 to 1849, was not merely a natural disaster. It was a human tragedy shaped by neglect and policy. It hollowed out Ireland's population and scarred its national memory forever. The old Gaelic way of life, its language, its music, its rural culture, nearly disappeared with it. By the 1850s, the famine had ended, but Ireland was a changed land. The population dropped from 8 million to just over 5. Those who survived faced a new reality: depopulated countryside, empty fields, and grief etched into every family's story. Yet, amid the sorrow, a new sense of determination took root. The second half of the 19th century became an age of activism. The hunger for self-government, home rule, grew stronger than ever. The idea was simple. Ireland should govern itself in domestic affairs while remaining part of the United Kingdom. The movement's most passionate voice was Charles Stewart Parnell, a Protestant landlord from County Wicklow, who became the unlikely champion of Irish nationalism. Through his leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party, he transformed Irish politics. Parnell and his allies won dozens of seats in the British Parliament and used their influence to demand reform. They fought for tenant rights through the Land War of the 1870s and 1880s, pushing for laws that would give farmers fair rent, fixity of tenure, and eventually ownership of their land. Landlords were forced to yield ground, and for the first time, the Irish peasantry began to gain real security on their farms. In 1886, Prime Minister William Gladstone introduced the first Home Rule Bill in Parliament, granting Ireland limited self-government. But the measure was defeated. Opposition came not only from British conservatives, but also from Ulster Unionists, the largely Protestant community in the Northeast who feared domination by a Catholic-majority Ireland. They vowed to resist home rule by any means. Still, the movement persisted. A second Home Rule Bill in 1893 passed the House of Commons but was rejected by the Lords. Ireland remained restless, caught between the dream of autonomy and the reality of division. Meanwhile, the Irish cultural revival began to stir. Scholars, poets, and playwrights sought to restore a sense of national pride through language and art. The Gaelic League, founded in 1893, promoted the Irish language, while writers like W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory celebrated Ireland's myths and history through literature. It was as if, after centuries of struggle, the Irish soul was rediscovering itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, Ireland was a nation on edge, its spirit renewed, its people politically awakened, and its divisions sharper than ever. The seeds of rebellion had been sown once again. The early 1900s brought Ireland to the edge of change. The dream of home rule was close, yet tensions between nationalists and unionists threatened to tear the island apart. Then came 1916. On Easter Monday, a small band of Irish rebels seized the General Post Office in Dublin and declared an Irish republic. The Easter Rising was crushed within a week, but its leaders, executed by the British, became martyrs. Their deaths ignited a new flame of rebellion. By 1919, the Irish people elected Sinn Féin, who refused to sit in the British Parliament and instead formed their own, Dáil Ireland. The Irish War of Independence began, fought between the Irish Republican Army, IRA, and British forces. In 1921, a treaty was signed. Ireland was divided. The Irish Free State in the south gained limited independence, while the north remained part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. Though the island was split, a nation had been reborn. The centuries of struggle, famine, and resistance had finally led to self-rule. From ancient Celtic tribes to a modern republic, Ireland's history is a story of endurance, a small island that never forgot its voice, its culture, or its dream of freedom.